protect us to have the best equipment possible. And we also have to make sure that when they do go in harm's way, they're out there for the defense of America, and they're doing it in a constitutionally approved way. And sometimes we forget all those little elements. Our next speaker is Kim Schmidtner, and she's a fine example of a person who, I don't want to say she sat on the couch or whatever, but she was not involved politically until the Tea Party movement started in 2009. And she founded the Lehigh Valley Tea Party and has moved on to other activities, training leaders, and involving herself in trying to get the best kind of school boards we can so that our kids' education moves forward. So without further ado, let me introduce Kim Schmidtner from the Lehigh Valley.
Thank you. Well, I'm here today to talk to you about the ineffectiveness of big government when it comes to public education. And when you look around at our education system today, you'll notice one thing, well actually an entire political system, you'll notice one major thing, and that's big government. And the federal government has been trying to get a hold of local education for many, many years now. And it was always the dream of the founders to have as much local control of education as possible. And in fact, they passed, there's 3 federal laws that prohibit the federal government from controlling curriculum and for local school boards. So, but if you see what's going on today, the federal government is dangling a lot of money out there to try to convince states and school districts to get on board with these federal mandates. Some of the ones that are more recent are No Child Left Behind, which was actually passed in 2001, which has placed a lot of burdens on school districts as far as compliance is concerned. It's had a lot of red tape and paperwork for the teachers to start to fill out. So they're spending more time in compliance than they are in teaching our children. I know a lot of teachers, and it's a very, very big complaint for them, and a lot of them have left the teaching profession because of it. Then came, more recently, the Common Core Standards, which is something that President Obama is currently talking about, and this is how insidious this is. Common Core National Standards will implement among school boards, schools, a race to the top competition through federal grants. If the states adopt Common Core Standards, they will be exempt from the onerous provisions of No Child Left Behind mandates. So in other words, take our money and it'll be easier for you. But the bad thing is actually lower standards in school districts. And it actually lowers standards for American education versus education that we're seeing in countries around the world. One of the major insidious things that the federal government did was the stimulus. The stimulus spent over $100 billion in education, and I'll tell you why it was so insidious in just a moment. But just keep that number in mind. And I mentioned there's the 3 federal laws, and they're circumventing that by trying to dangle this and try to convince states to come on. Now, all of these big government mandates mean that government is spending tons and tons and tons of money on education. And has that spending on education improved our education at all? Well, a lot of studies have said no. Federal education spending has increased 64% since the passage of the No Child Left Behind law in 2001. Since 1997, education spending has doubled from $33.5 billion to almost $70 billion in 2011. On average, the federal government spends $10,000 per pupil every year. So from K through 12, that's $120,000 that taxpayers are spending on students. This kind of sounds like a college tuition, doesn't it? Now, the stimulus temporarily increased that spending, but what it did is it allowed states like Pennsylvania to actually cut education spending and then backfill it with stimulus money to make it look like education spending was increasing when really it was decreasing. And you'll see a lot of this in the media today about spreading that Governor Corbett has cut education spending. Actually, he increased state education spending. And I'll give you some details on that in a bit. A lot of these districts took this one-time stimulus money, they mismanaged it, they spent it on long-term projects that needed continuous funding, which is exactly what the federal government wanted. Because they wanted schools to become dependent, I call it pushing the drug, money is the drug, could become dependent on this money. So we have to continuously increase taxes and spend more and more and more. Now in the state of Pennsylvania, we have seen a revenue double in the last 15 years, from $13 to $26 billion that's raised for education here in the state. Now, in the state of Pennsylvania, districts spend an average of $14,000 on students for their education. That's $168,000 from K to 12. But what are we seeing for that money? Little. There's been a lot of stagnation in the performance and test scores of these students. At the national level, since 2000, America only went from 14th to 15th in reading literacy in the world. And we actually dropped in math scores from 15th to 25th in the world after doubling spending. So these are not good things. Now on the state level, we've seen the SAT scores stagnate, combined scores reading and math at a little less than 1,000 points. So all of this money that we're pumping into education really isn't improving our students and preparing them for competition in the world and to get good jobs when they graduate. I just saw a story, Condoleezza Rice said that basically our education system is failing our students and is setting them up for a life of unemployment and dependence on the government. And it's very, very true. All of these mandates are dumbing down our children. They're not helping them. Now, all of these big money, whenever you spend big money, you get big special interest groups that like to suck onto that money. And so we've seen the growth of big public service unions. We've seen student enrollment in that since 2000. Student enrollment in Pennsylvania has dropped by 35,000 students. But staff levels have increased by more than 36,000. Now those increased staff members mean more public service union members because Pennsylvania is a forced unionization state. So those new members have to be members of the public service union. We see things like prevailing wage, which is a mandate that's put down by the state to increase project costs to taxpayers by 10 to 20%. Last year alone, Pennsylvania taxpayers paid $1.3 billion to $2.5 billion more on construction projects than they would have had to had it not been for prevailing wage. And what does that mean for you? That means that you could have received $400 to $800 more in your pocket that you wouldn't have had to pay in taxes. Wouldn't that buy a lot of gasoline today? So that's what that means to you. We're also on the midst of an explosion in the state pensions here in Pennsylvania. We're going to see a growth from 2010-11 to 2015-16 from $300 million taxpayer contribution to the PESERS, the Pennsylvania School Employers Retirement System. That's going to jump from $300 million to $3 billion in 2015 and 16. And it's very interesting. I just saw a report in the Easton School District where there was a conversation between several board members, and they said if we froze everything and just paid our additional requirements for the state retirement, for the school education retirement program, they would have to raise taxes 11% every year to meet their obligations to those contracts. So even if they froze everything else, the last and very insidious, that's a favorite word of mine today, is the district collection of union dues. School districts actually collect the union dues right out of the teachers' paychecks. Teachers don't pay those directly to the unions. That's taken out of their paychecks. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars in every single school district that the school district actually has to write a check out to the teachers' union. A lot of that money goes into political campaigns. So what does that do? That funds campaigns for legislators that fight reforms to these problems. And we see it here in Pennsylvania. And we like to say it isn't about a Republican or a Democrat party. It's a union party and a taxpayer party. Because right here in Pennsylvania, we have a Republican governor, a Republican Senate, and a Republican House, and somehow we can't pass these reforms that we're seeing passed in Wisconsin and Louisiana on school choice, prevailing wage reforms, the whole 9 yards. There's a package of 18 bills that give these reforms, and they're not being passed in Pennsylvania. Why? Because it's a union party. Then we have big media that lies about these things, perpetuates lies about state funding cuts that Corbett's guilty of. I mentioned the stimulus. Governor Rendell actually cut state education funding to basic education for K through 12 by $1.5 billion in 2009 and 2010, and backfilled it with stimulus money to make it look like it was an increase, setting a trap for the next governor that walked into that door. Governor Corbett actually restored state education spending to just slightly above what it was before Governor Corbett cut it and filled it with stimulus money. The other thing that the media likes to perpetuate lies about is charter school costs, when districts actually keep money for a student that they no longer educate. So with all of these big government, big education, big unions, and big media, we need to become the big taxpayers. That's what we need to do. You know, everybody walks around and says, you know, why doesn't somebody do something about all these things? Well, guess what? You're somebody, and you need to do something about these things. Educate your family, friends, and neighbors on these facts. Become your own media outlet. Who cares if the big media lies about these things? You take their job and you educate. Blog, write letters to the editor, op-eds, videotape your school board meetings that are very important to attend, and support your leaders in Harrisburg who are trying to push for these reforms. We heard at the recent Pennsylvania Leadership Conference that a lot of these legislators are trying to get these reforms passed, but all they hear from is the unions. They don't hear from us. They don't hear from school boards. It's important that they hear from us and support them. The authority to create and set standards belongs to the state and ultimately the school districts, and ultimately the parents, not the federal government. Parents should have the power to give their children the type of education that best suits their needs and abilities. Now, we just recently Leadership for Liberty started an offshoot called the Pennsylvania School Board Coalition. And that's a coalition of elected school board directors and concerned taxpayers who are actively participating to reform their local school districts throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Now, what we're doing is we're coordinating all these people because these problems exist and are the same in all school districts around the state. And it's amazing when these people start to coordinate. The unions and the administration have been coordinating for years. We, the taxpayers, have to do that now. So I hope you'll join me and become the big taxpayers that we need to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kim.